Very good, and warm welcome, everybody. Uh, Colin, beautiful picture with Artemis in the background, right? Or the picture from Artemis.
Yeah, it's Earth.
So a good, I would say, reminder of what we human beings can do, right? And very excited by this session. Just a small reminder: if you can have your cameras on, it's very nice. It's particularly because we are recording that, so your beautiful faces, it would be appreciated. Of course, if you can have your cameras on. So today, Colin, we'll be talking about one of your books, the Paradoxical Primate, right, which is as the 4D communities, which is dreamers, doers, designers, and doubters, as we look at the meta-crisis and try to understand. So it's a very central question, right, that we go back and forth and try to understand on our role in some of these cows. Some people prefer not to call meta-crisis, but if we take Nate Higgins, so he calls actually human predicament, right? So already there he puts humans as in this central role. You're a political scientist, professor emeritus at the University of Manchester, right?
Yeah.
Several books. And I was reading that you have been at least a practitioner of Aikido, the martial arts. Is that correct?
Yeah. Made me very popular when I went to Japan.
Yeah. And you're going to be presenting yourself a little bit more, Colin, but I just really, really happy to have you today. It is actually a question that was raised during your 4D unders about this tension. Is it the economics models or the humans, the role, right? And as usual, this should be a session with a lot of debate, but you're going to do a small pitch, right, Colin?
Yep.
And then we open up for questions at any time, questions in the chat. And Kazi, we're going to look at that, right? And also when we start the Q&A, you just raise your questions, your hands, digital hands. Kazi, did I forget anything?
Oh, all well on track. So just a reminder, we will, in the conversation in the chat, we will keep track of the questions from now. So I will open for the questions later on. But when we start with the Q&A, any hand up and any question that we can follow up.
Very good. I'm going to, pin you, Colin, now.
Yeah. Okay.
And you know, if you want to share any slides and so how to do. Very good.
I'll do that now, if that's okay.
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everybody. It's very nice to be here. It's unseasonably warm where I am. It's about 23 degrees outside, 23 centigrade outside. So it's quite warm. Okay, so I just wanted to start with a little personal digression. Does anybody know where this is? Apart from the people I've already told. No. Okay.
It's your house?
Nah, yeah, it would be nice if it was. It's Dover Castle, the nearest point to France in England, in the east of Kent, with Dover Harbour in the background. And the reason I put it up there is actually to do with the presentation, which is I was born in Dover, not in the castle, I hasten to add. But Dover town is down to the right of that picture, in a valley. And I spent most of my childhood either in the docks, where my father ran a boat, servicing various things across the English Channel, or on a farm which was just behind the castle, off to the left of this picture. There was a sheep farm just behind the castle, and it was run by a friend of my dad's, and I spent most of my holidays, weekends, even evenings in the summer on the farm helping out when I was a kid. And I suppose in a way that's what piqued my interest in human nature and has been with me ever since, partly because I spent a lot of time observing animal nature. We had horses and pigs and cows and sheepdogs, who were incredibly interesting animals. And so it sort of started me down a path of being interested in not just human nature, but other species nature as well, which although I spent most of my professional life doing other things, it's been a sideline and interest of mine ever since. And by the time that the first moon landing took place in 1969, I'd been reading this book. This is a book that was published in 1969, at the same time as the moon landings. Sorry, slightly earlier, 1967. It's a book cover you couldn't possibly get away with publishing now. I think that would be censored. But it was a book called The Naked Ape by Desmond Morris, and I actually read it originally. I used to do a paper round delivering newspapers, and it was serialized in one of the biggest tabloids at the time, the Daily Mirror. And my paper round took a lot longer than it should have, because I spent time reading the interesting stories, and this was one of them. And Desmond Morris was a zoologist who turned his attention to human beings, and the reason it's called The Naked Ape is fairly obvious. We are the only hairless ape. All the others are covered in fur. But it was a really interesting exploration of our evolutionary similarities, particularly with some of our primate cousins. And it's, as I say, it got me thinking from the age of about 14, 15 onwards about these issues on and off throughout my life. The second stage of this thinking, really, but one of the big watersheds, was a friend of mine, Norman Jarras, who was a professor at Manchester University, where I was a student in the mid-1970s, wrote a book. Norman was a Marxist, as I was at the time, and Norman wrote a little book called Marx and Human Nature, Refutation of a Legend. And for those of you who weren't around at the time or didn't mix in the sort of left-wing circles that I did, it was a pretty standard view on the left, not just Marxists, but lots of progressive people, that there was no such thing as human nature. Human beings were what we'd now call a blank slate or tabula rasa, and their nature evolved through their life rather than from their genes. And it evolved partly through experience and partly through adopting the cultures of the people and communities and nations in which they lived. And it was a fairly standard left-wing view that human nature could be perfected by creating a perfect society. If you created a society in which there was no competition, no private property, that things like discrimination were frowned upon and so on, human nature would adapt to all of that, and we'd all live happily ever after. Very much like the John Lennon song. I found Norman's book, it came at roughly the time I was beginning to question my belief in Marxism anyway. But I found Norman's book really, really useful in terms of refuting actually the legend that Marx had actually believed there was no such thing as human nature. He did believe that human nature was affected by the type of society we lived in, whether it was feudal or capitalist or whatever. But he didn't believe that there was no basic human nature. Jump forward another, what are we talking about, 20 years or so, and I was starting to study management. I was actually working in English local government at the time, but I was studying for a master's degree in public sector management. And one of the things that I became obsessed with was something called competing values framework, originally developed by Kim Cameron and Robert Quinn in the late 1980s. From various studies. And one of the things about the competing values approach was that rather than some other social science, which either assumed we didn't really have any preferences, or that all our preferences were about selfishness and rational utility maximization, that actually we had different preferences for different types of behavior. Although Quinn and Cameron didn't attribute this to our evolutionary origins, but they developed quite an elaborate model in which humans had contradictory interests about how we manage our organizations, which is what their focus was on. But actually it applied to a lot of other things as well, about personal behavior, for example, in their Becoming a Master Manager series of books, about organizational behavior more widely. And actually, some people have applied it to things like government and other social institutions as well. So I got very interested in that. One of the problems about it for me, though, was that they never explained why human beings behaved in this way in organizations. I would say, by the way, about this particular model, I've used it in quite a number of different countries around Europe, in Japan, in Libya even, and it has quite a lot of face validity when you explain it to people. A lot of people say, oh yeah, I recognize those contradictory things going on in my organization and contradictory behaviors by individuals. And we'll come back to this maybe a bit later. I'll just briefly, their basic framework is very simple. It says that there are two contradictions around organizations. One is whether or not they're focused internally, internal mechanisms inside the organization, or whether or not they have an outward-looking focus. And the other is between flexibility and discretion and stability and control, and combining those in a classic 2x2 matrix. They get 4 types of organizations. So clan-orientated organizations allow for a lot of flexibility and control, but are internally focused. So they're a very tight culture within the organization. People give quite a lot of given quite a lot of autonomy within it. Hierarchical organizations tend to be internally focused and focused on stability and control. Market organizations are very much about gaining market share, gaining advantage in the marketplace, and what they call adhocracies, which is very similar to Henry's adhocracy in his original 5 types of organizations, were ones which didn't have the sort of internal stability and control and didn't have a lot of internal focus, were tended to be outward looking but extremely flexible, responding to circumstances. One of the other people I was reading around this time was, some of you may have heard of, the Australian philosopher Peter Singer, and one of his books which influenced me quite a lot was The Expanding Circle, in which he tried to explain how humans developed ethics based on our evolutionary origins. And one of the quotes from that, which I've used a lot, which was is actually incredibly thought-provoking, which is that we were social before we were human. We lived in, most people reckon now, most anthropologists reckon, we probably lived in groups of up to about 150. They were very much social groups. They enabled human beings to survive, and without groups, we very likely wouldn't have survived. We know this now, and it's quite interesting because a lot of classical political philosophy assumed that we lived in tiny groups or even just family groups. So if you go back to people like Hobbes or Rousseau, they're very much individualist focused on individuals and their families. Whereas we know actually humans didn't evolve like that. Humans evolved in groups. And that has quite large implications about how we evolved, what sort of social instincts and social approaches we inherited. One thing I just added that, going back to my first slide of my history on the farm, is it's always been obvious to me that most animals have some sort of inherited behaviors. Some of them extremely complex inherited behaviors. So, for example, we bred and trained sheepdogs on the farms. Sheepdogs mostly are extremely good at herding sheep. And ironically, sheep are actually not bad at being herded. We had a group of sheep that we kept near the farmhouse in a paddock around the farmhouse who were used to being herded around by the dogs, and we used them for training the younger dogs because they reacted. By the way, just as a small aside, we had the first instance of, I think, of Babe. For those of you who've seen the movie about the piglet that thought it was a sheepdog, we had one of those. We had a piglet that we hand raised in the house because it had been the runt of a litter, and it was raised with the dogs, and it thought it was a dog and used to attempt to chase the sheep around the paddock. And quite interestingly, the sheep completely ignored it. Right, sorry. So getting down to how do we get social instincts? Well, one of the things that influenced my thinking about this is Steven Pinker's book, The Language Instinct. And the basic lesson of that is very simple. Pinker argues that humans, and when I say humans, I mean on average, most humans, we know there are always going to be exceptions to these sort of general rules, but humans are born with two things which come under the label of instinct. One is a desire to acquire a language, a method of communicating between human beings. And the other is an ability to acquire a language, that we can actually acquire languages. And there are lots of examples in Pinker's book of some extraordinary circumstances where humans have managed to acquire languages even when it wasn't readily available. For example, in a deaf school in Nicaragua, a residential deaf school where the kids were deserted by their carers and taught themselves a sign language, which was non-standard, which they'd actually developed for themselves. The other Pinker book, which affected me quite a lot, was his book, The Blank Slate, which, as you can see, is subtitled The Modern Denial of Human Nature. Pinker argues in this that, particularly since the Second World War, there was, in Western countries especially, a strong denial of the idea that there was any such thing as human nature, partly in reaction to what had happened during the Second World War and the Nazis' misuse of Darwin and social Darwinism. To say, so a lot of people after the Second World War believed there was no such thing as human nature. We all acquire our nature, partly individually from the lessons we personally learn, but also collectively through the communities and societies and families that we live in, and we acquire our cultural values from them. I argue in my book, sorry, I missed a slide. I argue in my book that actually we had two dominant views of human nature since the Second World War, and they are views of human nature. Even the blank slate is a view of human nature, because if you look at other animals, and particularly our closest cousins like the chimpanzees and the great apes, they all have very complex behavioral instincts. They behave very similarly to one another. There are individual differences, but they all behave very similarly to one another, and it's clearly inherited. There's a very small amount of cultural exchange, which we now know, which we didn't 30 or 40 years ago, but most of their behavior is determined by their genetics. And so that is a view of human nature. The second view of our view of humans, which we're somehow completely different from the great apes or chimpanzees, is that somehow or other humans in the last couple of 100,000 years shed all these behavioral traits that came with our genetics and became blank slates. Now, whether you agree with that or not, it's a view of human nature. It's that humans became a bit like a blank computer with no programs on it, which could actually be programmed in any way you like. And that is a view of human nature, that somehow we acquired this ability in our evolutionary heritage. The other dominant view in social sciences, which grew up in the 1960s and 70s in particular, and started to take over, came out of economics and started colonizing political science, for example, is the microeconomics views about human behavior. And that it boils down to the idea that we're all rational utility maximizers, that we all behave in the same way. Now, any economists I know who I've said, well, that's a view of human nature, they've all absolutely denied it. But clearly, if you believe all humans everywhere, regardless of their culture, their background, and so on, behave as rational utility maximizers, then that is a view of human nature. It must be. It's assuming that that must be an inherited characteristic. I think both of those are both right and both wrong. That we do inherit from our cultures certain characteristics. And I think Steven Pinker's argument about the language instinct applies here, which is that we have a inherited instinct to acquire social norms about how we behave to one another and an ability to assimilate them. But what those cultural norms are can vary enormously. Just as languages can vary enormously, which doesn't stop us being able to, if you take an English child and plonk them down in China when they're a few months old, they will learn Chinese and they will become a natural Chinese speaker, or vice versa. So where you grow up determines what sorts of cultures you may acquire, but the desire to acquire social norms in particular and language, I think, are inherent in the way in which we evolved. One of the other things that affected me as I started to question a lot of the stuff I'd believed in the 1970s was this interesting book by Don Brown called Human Universals, which was a sort of reply to Margaret Mead and a lot of the other anthropologists who believed that culture was a determining factor in how we related to one another. Brown pointed out, excuse me, Brown pointed out that actually there's a whole range of what he called human universals, which are identifiable in virtually all human societies. And there's a very long list of them in there. He also showed that some of the research that had underpinned people's like Margaret Mead's work had actually not really been quite as robust as they thought it was. But if people want to discuss that, we can later on. The other person that influenced a lot of this is Edward Wilson, who wrote his famous sociobiology book in the late 1970s. The best summary of his work is in this text, The Social Conquest of Earth, about how social species and various types of social species, not just us, but social insects, which is actually his personal specialism, understanding how ants and termites and so on managed to create incredibly social societies, which are quite amazing, without cultures, without any sort of communication of the sort that we have. So that's also worth having a look at. And then there were the people who were actually studying actual chimpanzees. The two most famous of these are Jane Goodall, who died recently, and Frans de Waal, who very different types of studies. Jane studied chimpanzees in the wild. Frans de Waal mostly studied them in captivity in large groups in zoos in Europe. But both of them identified all sorts of behaviors amongst chimpanzees, which are parallels and probably precursors with the sort of behaviors that we have as human beings, and are both worth having a look at. One of the books which was quite influential when I was writing my book, The Paradoxical Primate, in particular, was The Peacemaking Among Primates by Frans de Waal, which came out just before I started on that. One of the things he pointed out, there'd been a lot of writing about aggression between chimpanzees, both within troops of chimpanzees and towards other troops of chimpanzees and towards other animals, which they, in some cases, hunt, even other types of monkeys. What nobody had studied properly until Frans de Waal wrote this book was that actually within chimpanzee troops, there's also an awful lot of peacemaking that goes on. And his book documents huge amounts of cases where there was both conflict and cooperation, conflict and peacemaking amongst groups of captive chimpanzees in zoos. And this goes back to a famous phrase which Hillary Clinton used as a title of a book, but actually I think it has much wider ramifications. There's a famous African phrase which is, "It takes a village to raise a child." And this is actually true of human beings. The sort of Robinson Crusoe idea that we can quite happily manage on our own or in very small family groups, which a lot of the survivalists in America, for example, believe in, is complete nonsense. Robinson Crusoe, yes, managed to survive, but he then actually needed his so-called man Friday to help him out. But the bit that they miss out when they're discussing the Robinson Crusoe story is that he had grown up and been educated in a reasonably well-developed society. He had a great deal of knowledge that he'd got from that, and he inherited a whole load of materials from the shipwreck that he was able to use to survive. If he'd been shipwrecked without any of that knowledge or any of those materials, he'd have been dead in a week. And I think that point about human beings actually need each other in order to survive is incredibly important. Which takes me on to, well, why did we evolve these sorts of behaviors, social behaviors, social instincts within groups? Why did we learn to live together in groups of, in Robin Dunbar's famous number of 150 and slightly smaller groups? Well, the answer lays in what's called multi-level selection, which these are a couple of books which explore multi-level selection in detail. The idea that selection of individuals in evolution is only down to their individual genetics became popularized in the 1970s. And Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, which is a very unfortunate title, popularized the idea that it was only minor genetic differences that led to the evolution of individuals, which led to the evolution of species. The reality is that selection of species and selections of individuals actually take place on multiple levels. The most extreme level is species level selection. We've experienced on this planet 6 mass extinctions where entire classes of species have simply disappeared from the planet and open up the possibility of other species surviving and thriving. So the last one, when we were hit by an asteroid which wiped out all the various dinosaur species, created the space for mammals to evolve, and we wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that asteroid. There's a whole load of other levels of selection which have now been quite well established by evolutionary biologists. But the most important one for my argument would be that there's a group level of selection, that human beings, the various types of human beings that evolved a few 100,000 years ago, and there were probably 5 or 6 different species of human beings, including Neanderthals and Denisovians and so on. One of the things that determined which ones survived out of that was how well they survived as groups. And group dynamics are very different from evolutionary dynamics when it comes to evolution and survival in different sorts of environments. That's when I wrote this book about, where are we now? Just over 20 years ago, which was an attempt to try and clarify some of these ideas. And my basic argument in it was very simple, was that human nature is actually paradoxical, it's contradictory. The economists are right that we can be extremely selfish, but they're also wrong because they fail to explain altruism adequately. It's also true that quite a lot of anthropologists and others were saying that we were killer apes, that we were extremely aggressive, which is true, but they ignored the fact that we were able to make peace in groups and actually live together cooperatively in groups, that we cooperate and we compete at the same time. And even some of the social psychology experiments after the Second World War, the things like Stanley Milgram's obedience to authority experiments, actually, if you read Milgram's work properly, one of his conclusions was that human beings are contradictory, that we both want to conform, but we also, and this was one of his findings that gets neglected in a lot of the reporting of his experiments, we also value our autonomy. And there was always, in all of his experiments, some people who, usually a minority, it's true, but sometimes it was actually a majority, who rebelled against authority and refused to do what they were being asked to do at the time. So that was the basic argument in my little book, which is not terribly good, by the way, because it was very much me working out a lot of this stuff at the time. Not long after I'd written it, and much to my annoyance, I came across the work of Alan Page Fiske and quite a lot of people since him who've developed what's called relational models theory. And Alan was an anthropologist and sociologist, and still is, sorry. And he came to the conclusion from a lot of the comparative work that he'd been doing that there were 4 elementary forms of human social relation, which, very much like Steven Pinker's language instinct, meant we had 4 instincts for relating to humans in different and contradictory ways, which were then attached to cultural norms depending on the societies in which we lived. And those 4 ways were what he called probably the first one, which is communal sharing, which is that it takes a village, it takes a group of human beings to survive successfully in any environment. The second was what he called authority ranking, which was attributing some sort of authority to individuals within the group. And that can be anything from religious authority, skill-based authority, in modern societies, democratic authority because they've been elected as representatives to exercise authority, or even celebrity authority, unfortunately, in some of our modern societies. The third that he identified was what he calls equality matching, which is the idea that we want to be treated equally. It's and have rules which are seen as being, at least to some degree, fair. It's what I mentally call the Magna Carta dimension, which is the idea that there ought to be some rules, and even kings ought to be restrained by the rules and treat people fairly. And the fourth one, which he thinks was probably the last to evolve amongst various human species, was what he calls market pricing, which is gaining advantage over others in some way, exchanging goods for whatever you can get for them, and hopefully it's more than it cost you to make them or produce them or hunt them or whatever. So these 4 social instincts operate very similarly to the way in which the language instinct operates. I'd just point out, by the way, that if you look at, I'll stop here, if you look at the way that the competing values framework and the racial models framework operate, there's some very strong similarities between them, between the clan and communal sharing, between hierarchy and authority ranking, between the market and market pricing, and maybe a bit less so between the adhocracy and equality matching. But it's remarkable that you get these two models coming out of two completely different traditions in social sciences, one from organization and management studies, one from sociology and anthropology. I think I'll stop at that point because I've been talking for about 40 minutes. And I see there's been quite a lot of comments already. There is some other stuff that we can go back to if you want to.
Yes, I think that we might need to do that. Well, a lot of great points to reach towards, a little bit probably what's behind your mind when writing the book, and then reaching to the book and the paradoxes from different perspectives. Let me very quickly, unless anyone has a question right now, you can raise your hands. Remember, we already have a couple of questions in the chat that makes sense to go back to them. There was a very interesting discussion about, and it resonated with me when you were talking about the language, in particular, the will, the wish and the ability that later on you talked about, the ability and the culture. And those are also two things that if they don't work together, then they create new paradoxes as well. So that was part of the conversation. But with that part of the conversation, Martin, you had a question about what do we mean with language. Do you want to go through it, or do I ask it?
Yeah, it doesn't matter. I can. I just reflected that there was a lot of discussion about language in the comments and also in your excellent speech, but I didn't quite. Language for me can mean different things. So my question was, in this case, do we mean language as a advanced form of communication? So basically fiction, or I don't know what to call that concept of language, but a language that goes beyond primary communication. Is that what we mean by language in this case?
Well, certainly what I mean by language is our basic means of communicating with one another verbally and in writing later, which obviously came much, much later than verbal language. And the origins of language are quite clear in evolutionary history. Our nearest, there are two groups of species that have proto-languages. One is definitely chimpanzees. It's been well documented now that you can actually teach chimpanzees at least a small number of sign language words. I think the number's something like 250 words that they can be taught to use and associate with, use them in a really meaningful way. The other bit of language which we're only just beginning to understand is between cetaceans, dolphins and whales, who clearly communicate in quite complex ways, and we have no idea really what they mean yet. We're only just beginning to get to that, mainly because the technology is really only just being available to do it. So yeah, I mean what we'd commonly mean as language. And it's quite fascinating that certainly in the vast majority of human cases, human beings, anybody who's had kids knows human beings are desperate to learn languages as quickly as possible. I would say, by the way, even some relatively more primitive animals don't necessarily have some ability to understand language. When we were raising sheepdogs when I was a kid, my dad bought a sheepdog from a Welsh farmer who'd been given all his instructions in Welsh. And when my father started trying to give the same instructions in English to it, the dog just ignored him completely. It clearly didn't understand. It wasn't even the sounds. I mean, it obviously didn't understand the words, but the sorts of sounds that were being made, it recognized what that meant. And it just didn't work. It took quite a long time to actually retrain the dog to understand English instructions. Although I obviously didn't understand English. It was just the intonation it understood.
Super interesting. And there's a lot of research as well on the way that even our own languages define how our culture works, similarly as you have said in your comments. We have Geraldo, I know, and Anders, I know that you have your hands up, but there was a question from Adriano, and Adriano cannot talk because he's in a very noisy environment. Let me go through that one very quickly, and then we go through your raised hands, if you don't mind. So Adriano's question was, there's a direct link between living in groups and survival chances. Probably goes back to your discussion about, among others, the experience, the description that you did. So more recently in human journey, the life thread is no longer as it was during the cave age. Having that said, do you believe that humans will continue to be social? It looks that the social aspect of human life became very superficial nowadays.
Yes, I believe humans will continue to be social or become extinct. The most powerful psychological punishment that humans can inflict on each other, psychological as opposed to physical, is ostracism, is what we call in England sending people to Coventry. I'm not quite sure why it was Coventry that was picked on, but it's the idea that you ostracize people and you don't talk to them. And that is an incredible, and when it comes to incarcerating people, one of the most powerful punishments is solitary confinement. That's because humans are massively social creatures, and we find it extremely difficult to develop as normal human beings if we're not social. There's some absolutely horrible examples from Romania. After the communist regime was overthrown, it was discovered that children had been kept in some nurseries where they were just completely neglected. They weren't interacted with by adults. They were kept in essentially cages, separate from one another, and they had been absolutely psychologically crippled by that experience because they'd had no real human communication. I mean, it's a horrific example, but it happened, and it shows that humans only fully develop as human beings through interaction with other human beings. And I can't see that changing, particularly unless we evolve very differently to what we are now.
Aldo, you have a question?
Just a very quick and back to language, Colin, if I understand correctly, and try to translate to the corporate environment. So let's say at Ericsson, if we go a course, the people going this course, all of a sudden they come back and they have the same language, the same terms. So, I mean, if people listen to Henry Mintzberg and afterwards we start talking about plural sector or communityship, and so just to give some example. And I always thought that culture then in a corporate environment is these cues, these type of things that otherwise is completely different from another company maybe or another environment. And this is a very important element in what we sometimes just call culture in a company. Do I understand it right?
Yes, absolutely. And it's quite interesting, the interaction between different layers of culture. So from 1979 to the mid-1980s, I worked for British Telecom. And in the middle of that period, we had the Falklands War, where Argentina invaded the Falklands, Malvinas, and the British armed forces went chuck them out. I noticed at the time there was this incredible shift in the language inside British Telecom. So suddenly project teams became task forces after the military task force, which had been sent to kick the Argentinians out of the Falkland Islands. Even military terms like yomping, which meant going on a long march, which the British paratroopers used, crept into it. Things which sunk something became an exocet, which was the type of missile being used, air-to-sea missile that was being used at the time. There were a whole series of military terminology from the Falklands War, which suddenly got imported into British Telecom, partly because I think quite a few of the people who worked for BT on the engineering side had relatives who were in the armed forces or were really interested in that sort of stuff, partly because what was then British Telecom had a history in the Second World War, for example. Most of what had then been post office engineers went off to be in the British Army and to provide the communications for the British Army. So yeah, those sorts of wider social changes can have a huge impact on organizational culture, and organizational cultures evolve anyway by themselves. And I would argue that along with competing values framework, all organizations have some elements of all four of those values in them from the competing values framework. Some of them are very extreme in one direction rather than another. So a startup company may well be much more of an adhocracy and very not necessarily market orientated to start with, because it's more interested in developing whatever technology or service that it's concentrating on. But one of the ideas that I came across when I was doing all this work, can I just share again for a second and I'll show you. Where are we? Oh, yep. Let me just show you. Can everybody see that okay?
Yeah.
Because I can still see you if I leave it like that.
Yes.
This is a diagram I came up with, which one of my students named a bungee-gram, which was the idea that if you have two competing tendencies within an organization or an individual for that matter, that there's a tension between those two competing values or competing tendencies. And the way I tried to depict it was by envisaging somebody sort of tied to either pole by a bungee rope. And if you went too far in one direction, that would create extra tension in the other direction. And one of the things we see in the evolution of cultures in organizations is sort of oscillations between types of cultures. And this also happens in national cultures, by the way. There's some really interesting stuff on political culture in the United States about how it's varied over the decades between moves towards collective action and state-based action and individualism and markets, and how that tension has tended to swing backwards and forwards over time. So I think all of these things exist. We go back to competing values framework or the four social instincts. They evolve differently in different cultures, and they get different cultural artifacts attached to them depending on the sort of cultures they're in. So if you take authority ranking as an example, very contemporary example, in Iran, authority ranking under the theocratic regime has been very much about ranking people's adherence to the particular Shia version of Islam that they've evolved inside Iran. And there's some interesting discussions about whether or not the new supreme leader is actually qualified. I've seen some interesting stuff from some Shia theorists arguing that he doesn't actually have the correct qualifications to be authority ranked as the supreme leader because he doesn't meet the criteria set out in their particular branch of Shia Islam. Whereas come to Britain or America, and authority ranking for people making those sorts of decisions is very different. It's obviously to do with elections and popularity and political support. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Colin. Anders, you have a question as well? We cannot hear you. You're muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Colin, first for your excellent talk. And I have a long list of books I have to read, I understand. Now, I'm intrigued about this question of utility, and that we are all the time supposed to maximize our own utility and really be very selfish in everything we're doing. And I'm just wondering, is this part of what we could say human nature, or isn't it part of neoclassical economics and nowadays neoliberal economics, which coined this phrase of Homo Economicus, which tells all of us that this is the right way to behave, and we are sort of locked into a system where this is becoming or has become the norm, and if we don't act accordingly, we are stupid, we are losers, etc. Because we are social beings, as you said, and why the hell should we be only interested in our own utility? I find that, so that's one of the points where I'm very critical of conventional economists.
Okay, I can give you an example, a very large example of just how much economics gets that wrong. In 2018, the Office of National Statistics in the UK conducted a really interesting piece of research. They decided to look at, I mean, they didn't call it this, but it was essentially altruistic behavior in families and amongst small groups of families and friends, where they looked at what is clearly economic activity, but it's not monetized, which is how much do friends and family provide goods and services to other members of their small social circles. You know, everything from those of us who are parents know the stage you go through where you're relegated to being a taxi driver for your adolescent kids, providing them with free accommodation and meals and laundry services, providing them with psychological support. And that applies not just to your own immediate family, but to wider family members and to close friends and so on. And they decided to carry out a piece of analysis to try and, first of all, they tried to identify how much of that was going on in the UK from a whole range of different research sources. And then they imputed economic values to them. So if you were providing a room for free to your 21-year-old son, which we do just down the corridor, what's that worth economically? How much value does it add up to? And the results were absolutely staggering. If you add up the value of all of that in the United Kingdom, it comes to about 2/3 the size of British GDP.
Wow.
Which is absolutely astronomical. But it's not accounted for in public policy or public debate at all. It goes up and down at different times. It's pretty clear that, for example, during the pandemic, it went up enormously. I mean, just on our little housing estate here, where there's about 250 buildings, we had a Facebook page during the pandemic. People were helping out neighbours who couldn't get out of the house themselves, and so on and so forth. There was a big expansion of that sort of activity. It's contracted again since the pandemic went away, but it was there. And modern neoclassical economics doesn't take account of any of that stuff. And yet, as we know from people like Putnam and his work on social capital, it's extremely important to how well societies function. But we don't, we really don't account for it properly.
Thank you. Excellent.
We probably need to do our numbers in Spain because our kids stay until 30 plus. So
yeah, absolutely.
I have a question. Martin has another one later on. Sorry, Martin. I have a question about paradoxes. And I know that you like paradoxes. They are an integral part of your book. Probably there's not a paradox, but a different point of view of your picture from behind, seeing the Earth from the moon. So what we are seeing right now is that, and for example, last week with all the court cases in the US for social media is hooking individuals because of getting to the extreme of your paradoxes. So either you become very communal, or you like a lot the authority. You are cooperating a lot, or you are competing a lot. You are very selfish, or you're very altruistic. So how do you see that connection? Is it that, as Aristotle liked to say, that it's in the balance that the virtue is, or how do you see the paradoxes within us in our behavioral software or whatever?
Sure. Okay. I mean, the reason I adopted the word paradox was partly in reaction to my Marxist past, which was Marxists adopting Hegel believe that you get thesis, antithesis, so contradiction, and then synthesis. And I came to the conclusion that, well, the synthesis doesn't really exist. What exists is a balance between the thesis and the antithesis, using Marxist language. And there were several ways of describing that. One, but they all actually come down to ways of resolving, or sorry, most of them come down to ways of resolving it. So you can treat them as dilemmas. You can choose either the thesis or the antithesis. You say you can go to one extreme or the other. You can, in the Marxist sense, you can move towards a synthesis, which is somehow or other integrating the two extremes, which can be done in some cases. Some sorts of contradictions are susceptible to that. But the sort of contradictions that Robert Page Fisk was describing, that I think the competing values framework described, that I described in my book, and so on, they're not resolvable. There is no permanent solution to them. They are always in dynamic tension with one another. Sometimes they go to extremes. In my view, in most cases where that happens, they're unstable extremes, and they will get pulled back in the other direction at some point. So one of the arguments would be that some of the extremes of equality and freedom that overtook Western societies in the 1960s and 70s have led to a backlash towards more authoritarian, hierarchical approaches to how society should be ruled. I think there's no truth in that. That is clearly behind a lot of the particularly right-wing populism. There's clearly a desire for a more authoritarian, to reintroduce a more authoritarian form of social norms back into society, to go backwards to their idealized version of the 1950s and 1960s. So I think those tensions are always there. They're never going to go away. And any human society has to try and account for those. And if you look over the last 100 years or so, the extreme versions of human societies that have been attempted have usually collapsed eventually under their own internal contradictions. And even while they were still there, so in communist Russia or any of the Eastern European states. I remember traveling in Bulgaria back in the 1970s. And yeah, there was the official authoritarian planned economy. And then there was all the other stuff that was going on that the authorities didn't know about. I mean, we went on holiday there. We got off the plane. The person escorting us onto the coach to take us to our hotel, the first thing she did was try and do some illegal currency exchange with us. And that was pretty typical of the sort of thing that happened across the Soviet Empire in the 1970s. So that even where they supposedly had imposed this rigid hierarchical planned system, actually human beings found a way around a lot of that. And there was a huge amount of underground activity taking place, which the authorities in some cases knew about, in some cases didn't. Does that answer your question?
It's a way to see it. I was more on what if we, but following the question with what you said. You have said that if we go to the extremes, it's unstable, and then it creates the tension to try to go to the more in the center. But what if in the model that we have seen, and for example, for social media reports last week, it was that they have created a model that keeps us hooked because we stay in that corner, whatever corner we are. So what happens when that tension cannot be relieved, going back to the normal? Is there, perhaps I'm just trying to think.
No, I think you're
very
right.
Complex, but
I think that staying at the extreme in social media only works if there's a in real life situation in which you can stay there as well. So if, for example, let's say a young person who's going on the web and looking at conspiracy theories and things, if they're working in a normal environment with people who aren't doing that, then they're going to get pulled up short about it when they go to work, and they're spending 7 or 8 hours a day working with other people who've got different views. So there's an opportunity for them to come out of the bubble, at least for some of the time. I'm not saying that always works, and it's pretty clear that some of the sucking into extremism, particularly where people are, say, unemployed and at home all day and not necessarily going out and socializing, or if they do, they're socializing with other people with similar sorts of views to themselves, then yes, you can carry on with that sort of extremism. And we've seen plenty of examples in history, like in Nazi Germany, where perfectly ordinary, supposedly sensible people can be sucked into doing things that they wouldn't have thought they would have done a few years before. As I say, my positive side says that that's relatively unstable and it will eventually fall to pieces, and something different will come out of it. But it certainly happens, and people can end up at the extremes. That's quite long periods of time.
Thank you. This is super interesting because it can connect to things that we want to do in the sense of how to learn together, but learn with different perspectives, because then that can help you to bring to a more center space where you can discuss different perspectives. But
one thing I just add to
very
that,
big bubble here.
There's a lot of stuff coming out now around what's called the cooperative and social economy, which is and a lot of stuff about how you make those things work in a collaborative and cooperative way. And social psychology, I don't know about in other countries, but certainly in English, there's mainly from the United States and the UK, there's a whole load of books coming out, which is basically reviving some of the best stuff from social psychology and some of the stuff around how you overcome some of these sorts of problems. I mean, one of the examples I use, just as I'm a football fan, okay? So I think football is the perfect example of cooperation and competition working together in balance. In all sorts of different levels. Anybody watch the Arsenal match last night. The goal at the end was a perfect example of good team cooperation and unselfish behaviour by Martinelli passing the ball to allow it to score, them to score a goal. But football's at all sorts of different levels is both competitive and cooperative. So teams are cooperative when they're on the pitch together, but they also compete internally to get onto the pitch because they want to be the goalkeeper this game, or they want to be the centre forward for this game. They also collaborate, but you wouldn't think the two teams on the pitch collaborate, but they do, because broadly speaking, they accept the rules of the game. If they didn't, you wouldn't have a football match, because you wouldn't accept that, for example, if the ball goes between those posts, it's a goal. You wouldn't accept those sorts of rules. And that happens sometimes. I mean, I remember there was actually a war between two Central American countries about 30 or 40 years ago over a football match because of disputes about whether the rules have been followed or not. And football fans greatly enjoy blaming the referee when things don't go their way and all that sort of thing, but ignores the fact that underneath that, there is a broadly accepted set of rules about how the game is played. And which teams play against which teams in which circumstances and so on. So it's a really good example of how competition and cooperation can actually operate together in a balanced way to produce something really interesting. If you like.
Seems a good point to take my question, Casimiro. Very much ties into this.
Yeah, let's go.
I assume you're aware of this, Colin. Google did some extensive research into group performance, and I mean, basically, my understanding is that they came up with this idea of psychological safety being the key to creating great group performance. Yeah. So this seems to very much tie into your model and also the discussion you just had. So, but are you how much do you think there is in that? Is that as too simplified a view, and does it extend beyond? I mean, I assume it has some relevance, at least inside Google. I assume they did their work. I get something out of their work, but can it be extended outside Google, outside the corporation, or is it? How does it align with your model?
No, I think absolutely. Going back to the football analogy, if you take an example, Manchester City a few years ago was floundering as a club and a team, and then they had a huge amount of investment, and they bought a lot of really good players, and didn't do very well. And part of the reason for that was that they didn't create the sort of team psychological safety to cooperate with one another and be more generous to each other when they were playing. They didn't really play as a team very well. And it took Pep Guardiola quite a while to develop a culture within the team where they did actually play for each other as well as for the club. And they got a lot better at doing it. And I would argue that Mikel Arteta at Arsenal has done something very similar with the Arsenal team, and that their level of collaboration and cooperation and psychological safety to know that, for example, if they're not started at the beginning of a match, it doesn't mean it's not a criticism of them. It's a tactical decision to play the match in a particular way and bring them on later in the match, and it works extremely well. The other example of this was the England women's football team, who became extremely adept at doing that and extremely collaborative in the way in which they operated on the pitch, and saw massive success as a result of it. So yeah, as it happens, I was just reading a book about which included some really good examples from the Google, but there's lots of other research which shows similar sorts of things about advantages of groups that collaborate well together. being able to cooperate, being able to both collaborate well internally and compete well externally, and perform well.
Super interesting. Martin, follow up, or do we jump to Geraldo?
No, I think that's fine.
And I'm building a just as a note here. I'm building for students, for young students. I'm building a solution which is basically create a small teams where they can learn together, critical mindset, critical mind, how to deal with technology and things like that. And I'm talking a lot with psychologists these days, and they like consistently say that research shows that for in this case young people, but I assume it's very well connected with your comment, Martin, that for them to talk and work and be able to express themselves and build a psychological safety, it has 30% to do with the method, which is where we were working on extensively, and 70% with the person and the environment where they can actually work. So it's still about people. It's not about automating things for them to work. It's more about having someone in the room creating the psychological safety. And it's super interesting because it's very similar to all the things that you were saying. And it's what I read from here, and I know, Geraldo, you have a question, but what I read from here, Colin, is that the important thing is to balance and accept that we have these paradoxes in our life. And it's accepting those and living with those that we actually get the best of ourselves or the best of the team in those environments.
Absolutely. And that applies to all sorts of things. One of the examples I use when I'm talking about particularly relational models theory is families. If you've got kids, this scenario, most people will resonate with most people, which is you're all busy, kids are going to school, you're going out to work, usually both of you, if you've got a partner, you're going out to work. There's all sorts of household chores need doing. So you start off with communal sharing arguments with the kids by saying, we're all living here together, the house is getting dirty, we're not getting dishes washed up, we need to share out some of these tasks. And the kids' normal reaction to that is market pricing. How much? How much are you going to pay me to do the washing up? How much are you going to pay me to clean the floors or whatever? And the adults' reaction to that is usually authority ranking. Look, I'm your dad. I'm telling you, you've got to start clearing up after yourself. And the kids' reaction to that is equality matching. Is saying, oh, that's not fair. You're making me do things I don't want to do, and so on. And as soon as you explain it like that, most people go, oh, yeah, now I get it. I understand how that works. And we use those sorts of arguments all the time. And you're right, it's a question of what sort of balance you use in which sort of circumstances. One of the arguments that I've been trying to promote over the last couple of years here in the UK is that the new Labour government's come in extremely difficult financial circumstances and where public services are suffering extremely badly, and that's causing all sorts of problems about unpopularity for the government and public services and so on. And they are absolutely obsessed with things like bringing in AI to sort out the National Health Service. And one of the things I've been saying is, look, we've got 50 or 60 years of understanding that actually you can improve productivity in human-centered businesses like health services quite a lot by applying social psychology, or what used to be called organizational development, but seems to have got neglected these days, to improve performance. And there are plenty of examples around of doing that. One of the best ones is Buurtzorg in the Netherlands, which is where they've introduced these self-managed teams for nursing care for people in domiciliary settings, domestic settings, and the self-managed teams now run about half of domestic social care in the Netherlands because it's been so successful. It's cheaper, it's better, it works better, and it only involves a modicum of technology to help them coordinate themselves better. It's not huge amounts of investment in AI or anything to do that. So there are human-centered solutions to some of these problems that we seem to have forgotten them, particularly in the public policy sphere. I think people seem to have forgotten about them entirely, and that actually you can improve things enormously. And to go back to the footballing example, it's not just about buying in good players, it's about making sure players can play together as a team.
I do have a question, but Geraldo was first. Let's go, Geraldo.
Yeah. Well, I have a question. I'm afraid if I'm going to be able to articulate, it's just something that, because when we talk about economic models, or we talked about what's that, Homo Economicus, right?
Homo Economicus, yeah.
Is there something? It's actually two questions. Is there something around Homo Politicus? I mean, even if we take left to right, common political spectrum, because they are tied somehow on different human perspectives, economic models, and so. So is there a correlation here? And because I can give an example which has also to do with this tension that you mentioned. Let's say there is a very good documentary on Sweden. It's called the Swedish Theory of Love, that goes back to, some decades ago, Olof Palme, and the whole idea of making humans exactly what we discussed here. So wives more independent from men, being able to work and doesn't have this tyranny of the relation. Older people no need to be dependent of their children. Children don't be dependent on their parents, which means, by the way, Kazi, that's very common here. My wife left home when she was 17 to another city, right? What that documentary showed, to my surprise, that Sweden became one of the most individualist countries in the world, which is strange because you think it's a very solidary country, right? And also very lonely, right? So what I mean is that do we have a Homo Politicus or not? or is a completely BS what I'm trying to bring up here, if I manage to articulate?
I don't know enough about Swedish culture to know whether or not you're right about those things. I mean, certainly from a broad sort of political economy perspective, one of the things I think about Scandinavian countries in general is that they've been quite good at not necessarily seeing the public versus private tension, which has ravaged Anglo-Saxon countries, as being just, they're always mutually exclusive. So you either want to bring everything into public state ownership, or you want to leave everything in the marketplace and deregulate it all and so on. That it's actually quite possible to do both simultaneously and make them work together if you can get them working together properly, rather than seeing only one or the other as a solution. I mean, I would argue there's a third solution as well, which is around the cooperative and social economy stuff, which is much larger than most people think it is, both formally and informally. So, yeah, and it's quite possible to have individualist results out of what appears to be collectivist solutions. So people can, in strongly collectivist societies, if they react against that society, then they can become extremely individualist. I had a Danish friend who had a bizarre theory that he thought that one of the reasons that Denmark has quite a high suicide rate is because if you were depressed and lonely in Denmark, you didn't emigrate and go somewhere else because you thought it was the best country in the world anyway, and so the only alternative was to kill yourself. I mean, it's a bit bizarre, but you can sort of see what he was getting at. That if people react against that, I mean, my personal history is slightly similar. I mean, I was born and brought up in Dover. My parents got divorced. We moved up to Barrow-in-Furness in what was then Lancashire. It was a very small community. Everybody knew each other. I had about 3 million cousins because my mother came from the town and she had 5 sisters. And I hated it. I could not wait to get away. I left when I was 16. As soon as I finished school, I moved away and got a job in the pharmaceutical industry, actually, and moved to another city. So I really dislike that sort of closed, very claustrophobic environment, and some people will react like that. And that's, it's normal, I think. The question is whether you can create a society or a social group that you are happy with, and you can, which I managed to do partly through politics and other things.
Yes. Thank you.
And that is, I think, a perfect segue into the question that I had in mind, because when you mentioned the nurses in the nurse organization Buurtzorg in Netherlands, I learned about that because of the Thiel organization's book and how different organizations can evolve from more hierarchical, authoritarian, and then eventually into more community-driven and less, more distributed leadership and things like that. But the same as you have said with your personal experience, it is not that there's a right or wrong situation. It's that you have to find the one in which your paradoxes connect with your environment, kind of. Or?
Yeah. No, I think that's right. The books I was mentioning earlier, which you might want to have a look at, there's a very good book, which I'm 2/3 of the way through, called The Collective Edge, by Colin Fisher, who's at UCL in London, which is a very good rehearsal of the history of social psychology around all of these things, and I think takes quite a measured but well explained approach to a lot of the lessons that we've actually learned. And we know it is well underpinned by social science, but it seems to have been forgotten in a lot of political and public affairs discourse now for various reasons. There's also a book called The Power of Us by, I've forgotten the authors' names, but is also very good and covers similar sorts of territory, but and there's some really interesting stuff coming out about how you manage these sorts of things in groups, particularly from North America, Canada, and the United States. One of the things I've been really surprised about, I've been doing a lot of work on, obviously I've done a lot of stuff on cooperation in the past. One of the things I've been quite stunned by in the last 3 years or so is that I've missed the idea of cooperatives completely. I've worked in business school for the best part of 30 years. I don't think I ever had a conversation about cooperatives in any of the business schools I've worked in, including Manchester, which is the home of the cooperative movement. All the big cooperative institutions in the UK and some of the international ones are actually based in Manchester. It's got 250 academic staff at Manchester Business School. I never, in nearly a decade, had a conversation about cooperatives as an alternative form of organisation to either private or state-owned enterprises. And and yet they're huge. The International Cooperative Alliance, I'll suggest that something like 1 in 10 workers worldwide work in cooperatives, which is, absolutely massive. And yet tiny little types of organizations get huge amount of scientific work by social scientists lavished upon them, and yet there's very, very little about cooperatives. The amount of literature about it from social sciences is very, very weak. So yeah, I think but it's quite hopeful that there's a lot of stuff that's come out in the last decade or two, and more stuff on its way, which I find really interesting. I'm one of the main thing I'm doing at the moment is I write for a magazine, a practitioner magazine called Cooperative News, which is the house magazine for the cooperative movement, and we're doing a podcast around it as well, to talk about some of the issues that are coming up in different countries around what the UN is calling the social and solidarity economy, which is quite a big thing that the UN, the International Labour Organization, the EU, and various other institutions, the OECD, have been doing quite a lot of work around, and it flies right under the radar. Last year was the International Year of Cooperatives declared by the UN, and very few people knew about it. Very few people know that the incoming Labour government in Britain is committed to doubling the size of the cooperative and mutual sector in the UK. And there's a lot of work taking place around that, but most people I know nothing about it. So yeah, I think there's what I see at least as hopeful signs that some of this stuff is starting to come to the fore a bit more.
Really interesting. And I am very aware of the time. I have possibly one very last question, and it's very personal. Colin, you have said that you like football. I don't know, Geraldo and I didn't talk, but it seems that we decided to go for the light blue of Manchester. I don't know if you are from the red of Manchester or from even another color. I hope that was not a problem for the conversation.
No, not at all. I'll tell you my favourite joke when I lived in Manchester, which was before Manchester City came back as a big team, because they were very much the Manchester United fans used to say, we've got two world-class teams in Manchester, Manchester United and Manchester United Reserves.
That's good.
Very good. Wow. Thank you so much, Colin.
But I'm an Arsenal fan.
An Arsenal.
I'm a Southerner.
So red.
Colin, thanks so much. This is fascinating. I think I could stay the whole night here with this conversation.
It's a lot of stuff to cover.
Yeah, and here is from the heart, Colin, an invitation. You are already in our Substack, right? So two things I would like to plant a seed, and I was in this negotiation course that you always should just plant a seed. So I'm going to try not to oversell, but I have to, But it really, really would be so fascinating, because there are so many questions and follow-ups here, right? If we can continue this discussion in the Substack chat that we started, we can create new threads, right? I mean, one thing with the number you gave, I'm relating already, just as an example, the whole gift economy, that I thought it was just a concept, right? And so on and so forth. So if we can continue the discussions there, as you are, a member of our Substack. The other thing, Kaz, I'm thinking as a guest writer in the future, very much welcome. And because I see this is a start of a very important topic that I think we need to have much more conversations. Kaz, any or Colin, any final words before we close?
No, that's fine. And I'm quite happy to consider that. Yeah, the more conversations there are around this stuff, the better.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Colin. It has been fascinating, really.
Thank you.